coming to India, anybody famous coming to India, or any famous Indian also, to be at the Taj and to be photographed there, or it is very much present in advertisements. Trump was recently there, and we are not interested in seeing his front side, so we are seeing his back side. It is very important to understand the placement of the Taj Mahal, because in trying to understand history, history is not a bad word, mind you. History is just a time travel. Whether you move forwards or backwards, or whether you remain in the present, it is all history. History is our consciousness of our culture. It is a consciousness of our time. It is impossible to understand cultural events without understanding its place in history. Just 5 minutes before this presentation, like I was organizing a lot of stuff for the last couple of days, but still I missed my own personal, because I'm missing a blackboard or a whiteboard out here. So I quickly put on a piece of paper where exactly we are there when we talk about the Taj Mahal. And if you can pay attention to, there is a graphic of all the famous historical Mughal chieftains and kings and emperors above, but in the below sketch, you will note that on the extreme left, 1000 AD, interestingly, 1050, when the Christian world in its cultural resurgence is still in its baby form, in India, Hindu architecture is attaining its zenith. In fact, the three crowning glories of public religious architecture in India, because the early and medieval architecture invariably tended to be religious. So they were public monuments. So Khanderai Mahadev in Khajuraho, Lingaraj in Bhubaneswar, and the big temple in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu, or the Brihadishwarar. These were the crowning achievements of Hindu temple art, happening at the same time, contemporary, 1050, all of them. Very interesting how there is consciousness of each other. All the three magnificent temples you must see if you have not been. 200 years after that, Qutbuddin Aibak, as I said, enters Delhi, takes over Prithviraj's capital, runs over the principal temple out there, uses the spoils of the temple to erect a mosque, that is Qatul Islam, and of course the very famous Qutub Minar, that of course is in freshly sourced material. We have talked about it. And as I said, 300 years of the Sultanate. What is interestingly happening is Sher Shah Suri comes in for that 50 years, disturbs Babur and goes away. And a very important cultural event that is happening is Sher Shah Suri is able to not only dethrone Humayun temporarily, but he is able to drive him out of India, he and his wife. Humayun's wife is again very key factor in this. She is called Mahi Begum and or Bega Begum, and she is a very intelligent and culturally sensitive person. When they are banished, they take exile in Persia fundamentally, but move about a lot in Turkey. And like we are utilizing the time of the lockdown, Humayun and his wife, more so his wife than Humayun. Humayun was a little laid back person. They utilize the time of exile like the Pandavas did in honing their cultural skills. So they delve deep in a lot of cultural studies in Persia, in Turkey, and they get back a lot of what you call learnings. Architecture somehow being a physical manifestation of several cultural derivatives, or building sciences being that, where art and science, it is said, come together, but fundamentally it is like the physical encapsulation of cultural imports. So when Humayun comes back to reclaim his throne, they are performing a lot of very interesting what you call, or rather they are infusing culture with fresh blood, and we will see a token example of that later on in the presentation. But having given this small bit of what you call introductory session, we will delve deeper into the subject. Before we get into the subject of the Taj Mahal per se, can I put a question? Like, of course, I do not expect you to answer here, what you call aloud in the audio, but in your mind, you can answer as to, if I put a question as to what is the Taj Mahal? Is it a mosque, or is it a tomb, or is it something else? Then what will you say? So we can discuss later on the end of the session. Fundamentally, the Taj Mahal is a tomb, fundamentally, but very appropriately, it is a Rauza. A Rauza is a combination of a tomb and a mosque together in a unilateral composition. Only in the case of the Taj Mahal, the tomb dominates the mosque intentionally. So you hardly note the mosque. But there are other beautiful examples which we shall see in this presentation, which explain this Rauza concept better. But let us understand just quickly a symbolic difference between a mosque and a tomb. A mosque is a prayer place modeled over the residence of Prophet Muhammad, because we know that the land around Jerusalem, whatever religions have come up from there, whether it is the Jews, that is Judaism, whether it is Christianity, whether it is Islam, they had to had a lot of struggle. They faced a lot of opposition, and to establish themselves, they had to fight it tooth and nail. Prophet Muhammad's first mosque was his own home, which was an open courtyard surrounded by cloisters, which later on went into holy symbolism. And intentionally, the mosque typology has been developed in Islam to be democratic, welcoming, multi-axial, open-ended from several sides. People can enter, get out, move. It's more of, being able to advertise yourself, being able to be welcoming for people to access it, because otherwise in that entire world of Arabia around, there was so much of opposition. Whereas the tomb here in you can read, I have given the label, so I will not repeat. Very famous places. This is the Jamiat Sikri, and that is what you call the Mosque of Sana'a in Arabia, that is in modern day Iraq. The tomb form, as against the mosque form, is very graded, is very centric. It is almost mystic, as if it is encapsulating or enclosing a soul within. This is a fundamental difference between a mosque and a tomb. Of course, we are all aware, is to consecrate or is a memorial. It's a memorial, what you call, building, as a matter of respect. But it also has got a lot of philosophic and religious connotation. Coming to the design decision making for the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan had a very big mounting when he mounted the Taj on a massive pedestal in the concept itself. Very interestingly, what happens is Shah Jahan gets power of the Mughal throne in 1627, and in 1631, unfortunately, his favorite queen, his Mumtaz Mahal, passes away, and history is replete with all the messages through popular culture and films that it is out of love for his wife that he built the Taj Mahal, which is true. But that is not the only fact. There is parallel cultural consciousness when you, what you call, make such a big investiture. It is not only just one thing, but there are several things which are coming together. And in that respect, we must appreciate Shah Jahan and most of these Mughal princes. They carried good education, good training, were very educated and aware, not only about their own lands, but also the lands to the east of our country. I'm sorry, to the west of our country, the far west. And that link traveled up to the Greco-Roman culture, because Europe or Greco-Roman culture was very much invested in Asia Minor. which was a direct point for Persia and the Safavid Empire, and also the huge intermingling with Arabia, with the Israel lands and Egypt, up to Egypt. So there was a cultural continuum, and the Taj Mahal was mounted on a very, very ambitious program, wherein Shah Jahan made it a point to instill. First was the selection of the team. So there are very many historical, what you call, writings about who were responsible. We have a bad habit of always searching for singularities. Like we want one Tendulkar, we want one Bhagwan Ramchandra. Similarly, we are all wanting who is that one architect who has made this Taj Mahal. As if, suddenly there was one brilliant Howard Rourke tumbling out of the fountainhead, and one fine night he had a bright bulb of an idea, and he was so talented, something like we expect. No wonder Tendulkar was that much, or it is not to insult the personalities, but we are always searching for singularities. But the great things in life, the great things in world culture have been achieved by pluralities, or by the, what you call, by us as a whole, or as us coming together. And this consciousness was very much there. So Shah Jahan went about building up a team. Whenever a great work of art happens, it is said that the king, the priest, and the architect, builder, that is the architect engineer. The architect engineer, the priest is the philosopher, and the king, who is the political head, who is going to fund it, who is going to take the decisions. These three people come together. In this case, the philosophers were less important because they were building an established typology, mind you. When Ashok the Great first went about building the great Indian public architecture, at that time he didn't have a precedent, because religious architecture in India was not at all mounted on a big platform, because the Vedic practices were very comfortable operating on a Yajna Kund. And Ashok was the one who realized the potential of using religious edifices as media. And it was a huge problem for him as to how to generate a new typology. So the importance of the philosopher was very high. Here the importance of the philosopher was relatively downplayed, because the architects themselves were getting a lot of philosophies, of traditions which were almost, by the time the Taj was built, you had 1000 years of Islamic history. And Islamic, what you call, philosophies are borrowing heavily from Hebrew and Christian, the Semitic religions. If you read the Quran, then you will find all the Hebrew prophets straight away getting into what you call, and it happens when you're coming from the same region. Like if you read Guru Nanak's writings, or if you read the Sikh, what you call, holy books, you will find all about the Purans and the references, and the common this thing. So the decision making, a site was chosen at the bend of the Yamuna. Now, a very, very powerful and beautiful location, and it was decided to plot the Taj Mahal's campus in a charbagh pattern, which was a representation of the Islamic garden. I am now going to speed up a little, taking in you initially, because there is so much to say and share. Now herein, we are seeing, the location. I am using Google Earth. We have that benefit, and the Taj has been designed to be screened off. They have designed it to take you along. The architects have guide. All good architecture tends to communicate to you. It is like a guided tour. The architecture itself communicates, even if the builders are dead. So the Taj invites a meandering approach. You come from the main Agra town, which is to the west of what you're seeing. You're seeing fundamentally a north orientation upwards, and then you meander. You're coming and you're searching. You have heard in your consciousness you have the Taj, and you're trying to reach out to the gate till you come to the first forecourt. So it is a compounded, what you call, enclosure, wherein you fall into a first enclosure. So there is sufficient care taken to wheel off or screen off the Taj, and the designers are guiding you to how you should see it. And you're forced to enter through this very big, a very big building itself, the gateway building. Almost from depending on the from the point that you measure it, is about 60 to 80 meters in depth. So you're traveling that distance, and before you reach the forecourt, of course, you have you're with a singular purpose. You are moving along the lanes, and you fall through the court inside, and the Taj reveals itself to you as the builders and the designers warranted through the framing. An extremely beautiful monument, wonderfully beautiful. And one of the fundamental philosophies of the Taj derives from the Quran, which says that truth is God, that which is verily truthful, that which is verily beautiful, is truthful, is godly. And the Vedic religions say the same thing in Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. The Taj has got a walk and an anti-walk, because you walk from the gate to the monument, which is a revelatory walk, and then you have a pensive, recollective walk back from the monument to the gateway, and then you climb up to the niches and chambers of the gateway building to your right and left, and you again relook at the Taj, which gives you a fresh frame. The Taj is all about frames and frames and frames. It's a brilliant example of good design, where you're taken to the whole, then to the parts, from the part to the whole and back several times. When you look at the whole, you're not attentive on the part, and when you're looking at the part, you have no idea of what the whole is, or you have little ideas to what the whole is. So as you walk towards the Taj Mahal goes on you. It's a massive building. It's massive, and it has got a huge human connect. Later on, we will see how through proportions, the human connect is also expressed. But fundamentally, a building is for the human being, who is the patron of that building. Therefore, the respect to the human being, how a building forms a relationship with the human ideal, or the human activity, or the human function, or the human desire, and how successful it is in this relationship, also defines the success of a building. Extremely massive monument in its plinth, mounted on a plinth, because it's special, it's something special. So it cannot be just sitting on the ground. It is lifted up on a pedestal, a massive plinth. The plinth itself is about 100 meters square, 100 by 100. And the Taj, the what you call, if you leave alone the minarets, the minars, the building contained within itself is about 60 meters square. And have a look at the human figures in front. That will give you the scale of the building. The Taj is rendered in white marble. Much of it is Makrana from Rajasthan, which was very carefully chosen. Now, the decision to go in for a full-blooded white monument was a turning point in Islamic architecture then, and of course, Indian architecture also then. Why, we will see in the further slides. But we will continue on our journey towards the Taj, that is the walk. Now, this is the walk to the monument, wherein to keep the purity of the plinth, like the Taj Mahal's beauty is tried to be achieved in the purest possible manner. So that purity cannot be disturbed by a staircase which comes in front. I'll just go back to explain to you. You plonk a grand stairway in front, and it disturbs the compositional purity, which the architects never wanted. So the staircase is hidden, like in a womb of the plinth. So you make a side entrance through a projection, and what you see in front is a pure undisturbed plinth blending into the marble. You climb up the staircase, and the minar grows on you as you move. We will see a minar more closely later on. and you get up to the plinth and experience the monument. We will come back to the monument. We will break away a little. Like we'll also follow the principle of the moving from the whole to the part and to the various different facets. So this is the concept of this is a symbolic concept of the Islamic paradise garden. So uh, after the judgment, after death and the judgment, when the Chitragupt in our culture, and if you do good deeds, then you go into the paradisical garden, and that becomes symbolic for a memorial monument. And the Taj is consciously placed eccentric because the Charbagh pattern was puritanically centric, and most of the monuments up to the Taj, they followed the centric arrangement. Most of them, not all. The Taj consciously decided to have an eccentric, what you call, placement. Much of it to pay respect to the Yamuna itself. It's very interesting, how you respect a very important natural event like a river and establish connection with it. To my mind, I recall a very interesting World War II monument placed at the end of Notre Dame in Paris, which the plinth of which is the level of the river of Seine, and it allows the waters of the Seine river to come in when it is flooding and go out as a mark of respect to the martyrs. It's a Jewish memorial. Something like that. It builds a relationship to the river. Later on, we will see how the wall is broken off completely at the Yamuna interface. Here it is. So there is no wall on the Yamuna side because of the intense respect that the monument forms with the river. Of course, like we saw earlier on, I don't know whether you noticed in the Google image that there was an intention of having a counterpart monument in black marble on the other side of the Yamuna, and there was also a Charbagh, what you call, garden there. I forgot to point it to you here, and due to time constraint, we cannot go back. But whenever you're in Google Earth next, you see there's a symbolic, people have preserved that concept in the landscape still, and you can see it. Here in the Taj Mahal, onto the Taj is fundamentally facing south. It is facing south. Okay. So on the west is the mosque naturally, because when you pray, they will have to face Makkah, which is on the west side. And on the eastern side, there is a caravanserai or a resting place for travelers. And I would like to take you through the journey of the design of the Taj, or the decision making of the design of the Taj Mahal, which actually is a collective design across time. It is not something that is suddenly coming across overnight. This is the tomb of Isa Khan, early Sultanate. I will quickly take you through this. Progressing into the aesthetically more appealing Lodi tombs. The two brothers, Sikandar and Ibrahim Lodi, both are very beautiful but very similar tombs, and very strongly influenced by the Hindu preference for the lotus. So most of the artisans, and there are a lot of advisors coming from where Hindu artisans, even Hindu, what you call, architects and men of knowledge who were consulted, and there were deep influences. This concept of the Kamal or the lotus progresses further and ends up in what is thought to be the culmination of the Sultanate period, which is the tomb of Sher Shah Suri, completed a little before 1550. It is almost about 100 years before the Taj Mahal is completed. Now this is in Sasaram, Bihar, an extremely beautiful monument in its proportions, in its organization, in its compositional values, and all that is coming through the Sultanate is peeking out here in its design quality. And this is also a building which is a very strong influence on the Taj Mahal. In fact, what Shah Jahan did is he made a crack team, and it was a very big team. Not only the principal architects. The principal architects are named as Ustad Ahmed Lahori, Mir Abdul Karim, Ustad Isa Shirazi. But there was a huge team because it was, there was so much to do, and one of the first acts was a study tour. and the organizing committee set about the crack team on a study tour. Coincidentally, this particular monument, the tomb of Sher Shah Suri, was part of their what you call study tour. There are historical records, there are epigraphical records at the monuments that this crack team had visited. But their visit started off in the Deccan. We will come to that quickly. And in the Deccan, the visit started off in a very, very beautiful Rauza, or a combination of a mosque and a tomb in Bijapur, which is called the Ibrahim Rauza. This was the sixth king, the sixth Adil Shahi in the Adil Shahi lineage, and he ended up building what you call a Rauza of extremely beautiful proportions. So much so that his son Muhammad Adil Shah, the seventh king, he decided to beat his father in scale rather than in delicacy. Therefore, on the bottom right corner, you will see Gol Gumbad, another very significant monument with one of the largest domes in the world, which is a contemporary of the Taj Mahal, almost finished here and there, a few years here and there from the Taj. And the makers of the Taj were very conscious of that the Gol Gumbad, or Muhammad Adil Shah was ambitious enough and trying to make the biggest clear dome structure. Clear dome means in the span there is no interference of any further prop in the world. Now the Gol Gumbad is 148, but the Taj Mahal's architects were not obsessed with that my dome has to be the biggest, my dome biggest. They were not obsessed. So the Taj ends up a little small. The Taj dome ends up a little smaller than the Gumbad at 142 feet. It's about 148. So this is the Rauza concept of Ibrahim at Bijapur. Do visit this monument, extremely beautiful. Its beauty cannot be captured in drawings and photos like this. This is the section. I want to draw your attention to the false ceiling out here. And later on that goes as a cultural, what you call, influence in the Taj also, that you have a true dome and you have a false ceiling below for, the principal tomb chamber or the hall of the tomb to relate with the ceiling. And a lot of, in structural design, the dome, which itself is a mechanism of arch action. At the bottom, it releases a lot of thrust outside, so it is held by many means, and then there is a progression from a hemisphere to a square through a methodology of pendentives and stalactites, which is a different subject altogether. We will, you can always find out more about it. There's a section of the Gol Gumbad which I wanted to show you how the tomb structures were organized. Invariably, there is a memorial or symbolic tomb at the floor level, at the plinth level, and the main consecrative, what you call, burial happens in a chamber below, the subterranean chamber. The same thing with the Taj. So there is an inscription in Bijapur of the visit of the Taj's crack team. There is an inscription in Mandu. We are seeing the tomb of Hoshang Shah, wherein there is the first confidence that is achieved in making a building which is fully white, because there's this push-pull whether to make it fully white, because white marble against the Indian sky, which is not really blue, because in most of summer it is completely burnt with the glare. So it is a very faint, almost whitish blue. So white, a full white monument does not look good. That was a great challenge. And the tomb of Hoshang Shah was a confidence builder. When we, or in our lifetime, when we have availed train travel and gone to one of Delhi's busiest terminus, that is Hazrat Nizamuddin. Hazrat Nizamuddin is one of the principal terminus of Delhi, along with New Delhi and Old Delhi. Just next to the railway station is this tomb of Khan Khanan, and you have to pass it while going to the railway station. But hardly does anybody even look, and even having looked, hardly is anybody stirred. There was a point of time when I was rushing to take a train, not that I was late, but neither was I very early, and I was shocked to see this, and it made me pause and have a good look at it. And later on, I made it a business to find out. So much like the Taj Mahal, a precursor This was one of the jewels of the courts of Akbar, a monument, a tomb monument to him, built about 30, a good 30, 40 years before the Taj was even commissioned. And look at the model, look at the study model that goes into what will later on happen. And look at the plan, very strong Hindu influences being seen, the Garbhagruha. And these influences are coming through cultural interaction and not due to any imposition. You look at the tomb chamber, almost like a garbha, and which is the cube, the pure cube of the garbha is getting cut off by the approach, what you call tunnels or the approach vestibules, where there is a level drop, as you can see in the photograph. And this monument that nobody of us are aware of only. I accidentally discovered it in one long lost journal of, which is called, the Bridge Bhashis of Mathura have united to, have a cultural magazine called Indologica Bregenza. And accidentally I discovered an article on this monument in Agra called Chini Ka Roza, and nobody knew any about it. But Google knows a lot about it, but we are not aware. Now look at the proportions. This was finished a good 10-15 years before the Taj was commissioned, on a lesser budget and very strongly influenced by the Persian applique technique. So there is this push-pull happening. Persia was all about building in brick. Greco-Romans were building in limestone, marble. The cultural development of architecture as culture passed through Asia Minor, Persia, Afghanistan, it was all clay brick. Very good at brick, good brick. And when it came to India, brick was not of a very good quality in India. So it was all mostly timber architecture. But right from Ashokan times, there was an identification of good quality sandstone and basaltic rock in India. Of course, there are very many other varieties also which have been used. And the profession of building took up stone as a building material of greater permanence. And in the Indo-Islamic architecture, the Greco-Roman and Persian work came and interacted with stone, and the result was something different and very interesting. Now, the Mazar of Salim Chishti, it is like a guru monument, and it was also a confidence builder, though a very small shrine, confidence builder in making something completely in white. Akbar's tomb in Sikandra, very strong Hindu influences. I forgot to tell you that, like there was so strong intermarriages with the Rajput princesses. Jehangir's wife was a Hindu. So Shah Jahan, who is commissioning the Taj Mahal, his mother is a Hindu. And Amir Khusro, another example, how it's not only about the kings. Amir Khusro's mother was a Hindu. Amir Khusro was Middle Sultanate. And whenever he used to be referred as a Persian poet, he used to get very angry actually. And he says that I am from Hindustan, I am a Hindavi. He used to call himself Tuti poetry, belonging to the land. Akbar's monument, if you have not visited in Agra, is a must visit because a very beautiful combination of Hindu and Muslim architecture, married together based on a mandala format. And there is this fight between red sandstone and white marble. The precursor of course to the Taj Mahal. And it is also how you put motifs, inlays, iconography. And we will come to iconography a little later because the Persians and the Safavids in Samarkand and Bukhara, they went to extreme extents of very extremely vibrant inlays and iconographical patterns. So the decision making as to how India should adopt it or how Indo-Islamic culture has to adopt it was very special. And that fight always happened. This is the mandala format. Also as much solid as void. This is something that I specifically want to talk about. That all great architecture, all great building goes back to historical times, wherein there was this very philosophical balance between built and unbuilt. or solid and void. Sun temple at Modhera, you excavate the kund and use the building material to make the temple. This is prehistoric temples in France, wherein look at the plan, it's a cutaway plan, where is as much void as much solid. This is the pavilion concept which is influencing the tomb architecture of Islamic world. This is from Persia. Later on, it is getting compacted and refined in the extremely beautiful Humayun's tomb, one of the turning points in the development of the Taj Mahal. This is a section and the planar development. The Taj plan is almost this, where again it is as much void as it is space. The tomb of Humayun, had it not happened, the Taj wouldn't have happened. Extremely beautiful. And this is the contribution of the queen. It is, Bega Begum. Humayun would be lost drunk or in poetry or in reading, or in ghazals. So it was one enterprising lady, having brought all the collective wisdom during her exile. She ends up doing this monument. Still, many scholars make it compete. When if you have to vote for the Taj Mahal and vote for the Humayun's tomb, there are still a few votes going in favor of the Humayun's tomb, and you can see the fight between white and red, and also the plinth.
I think your voice has gone.
Is it come back now?
Now it's come back. Yeah.
Okay. We are very sorry for the interruption, but I hope you can hear me now. So we will move ahead from the Humayun's tomb, which is a turning point in the development of the Taj. This is how it is placed. It is still a very centric placement. We will quickly revisit the huge influences of Persia, that is modern day Iran, and the Safavid Empire, which extend up to Samarkand. So there's a lot of influence of Bukhara and what happened in the formerly southern USSR. So mostly brick monuments. Persia adopted the Western concept of scale, which is very direct, tall, big, direct, which is nice, very logical. Something that is straight and logical is something that is, the ideal. The Oriental and Eastern thought, our thought, which belongs to the East, is something different. The difference is here. In a Christian cathedral, the bringing in of light is very formal. It is a sense of divinity. In our temple architecture, the taking away of light and moving into darkness and depth is a sense of scale, is a sense of, achieving depth, higher depth. Very different, very informal approach of subject. And the Taj displayed a marriage of both the formal and the informal. Isfahan. This is a special photograph from a scholar. This is Mr. Hamiz, an acquaintance, and here Dr. Maseed Hamiz, and here you see the great mosque in Isfahan, which is very beautifully adorned in applique, that is glaze tiles, blue glaze tiles. Superbly done, to a point of romance. So the Taj's architects had to take a decision whether to go in for this romance. But consciously, a decision was taken in India of restraint for various reasons we will talk about. And when we see this restraint, so the influence of geometric patterns, or the work in aesthetics that was performed in West Asia was adopted by our country, but it was adopted with restraint for various reasons. Because of that, one of the fundamental reasons is the underlying ethic of the land of humility, of restraint, of balance, of not overdoing anything, holding back. So another precursor to the Taj is the father-in-law's tomb of Jahangir, that is Ismat-ud-Dawla, wherein a very beautiful, it's like a small jewel, And look at this photograph. This was another decision which, strongly influenced as to how to go about inlays in Taj, because if you tend to, though there is a lot of romance in these inlays, it has effectively ended up turning the color of the monument as to off-white. It is more, yellowish, brownish, rather than a white. And the Taj was intended to be more white than non-white. So the intensity of inlays in the Taj Mahal was further graded and controlled. And this is what the insides would be, the upper chambers or the principal chambers. Very, very. That was where Persia would come in, or Samarkand and Bukhara would come in. This is the romance of Persia on the left and Samarkand on the right, and some of its ways work. But we decided not to go for this high romance. Later on, we will see why we didn't choose to be Baroque. But this is the Great Mosque in Bukhara. Look at the dome, which is a strong influence for the Taj's dome. This is a shrine of Amir Timur in Samarkand. The placement of the minarets, and there is a record, there is an epigraphic record of the Taj architects having reached this place. And look at the bulbous nature of the dome, the onion dome which is influencing the Taj, and look at how, like the bowstring of a kite, the thrust at the bottom of the dome in the mechanism of the pure arch action is tied, and that tying, that structural event is celebrated by articulation, by applique or inlay articulation. And the very strong influence is the Sulaimana Mosque of Istanbul, and there is a historical record of a batch of the team of architects having gone there. There is also a reverse influence of the very famous Egyptian architect working with the Ottoman Empire, which is Mimar Sinan. In fact, one of the participants asked, I'm very appreciative that many of you who had registered reached out to the speaker with their questions, and though Mimar Sinan, one of the icons of Ottoman architecture, he passed away a good 40 years before the Taj was commissioned. Still, a batch of architects were sent, and it is said that the culture that Sinan left behind, it traveled to Persia, and there were a batch of architects came from there, in what you call contributing to the design. Now, this particular, which actually is formerly the Hagia Sophia of Byzantine Christian kingdom, later on taken over by what you call the Islamic, or it was a takeover, and instead of being broken, in fact, they couldn't break this. It was such a huge and big and strong monument, so it was decided to be converted into a mosque, and the minars were implanted later. It was a huge contribution to the composition, and the minars gave a sense of a platonic feel. Platonic means a pure geometrical, philosophical sense which is ingrained in our being, which invariably looks beautiful. And the placing of the Taj's minars got a lot of confidence from the Turkish work. A very small batch also went to Athens, it is recorded. And of course, consciousness of the Parthenon was awash in the whole of West Asia. Now, why the Greeks were very confident in building all white monuments was that the Mediterranean sky is a deep blue, azure. It's azure. So the contrasts are beautiful. We don't get that liberty in a place like India. Proportions are very important. A dominant proportion in the Taj Mahal, as a dominant proportion in very many other great works, is something called as a golden section, which many of us are aware of. It's a very particular proportion or ratio, which is 1:1.618 or 1:1.6. And this proportion, of course, you can have a separate session on this proportion entirely. So much has been studied about this and known about this. But fundamentally, this is a fundamental proportion occurring biologically in nature. You look at the beetle. So in the proportion of its overall body to its limbs, or in how it grows, how how a tender leaf progresses to an overgrown leaf. It is always increments in the proportion of 1 is to 1.618. So nature shows so many such relationships which are occurring biologically at this ratio, which is getting into us as Homo sapiens being at the head of animal creation, and something that gets into our psyche through our genes, and it is a proportion that we enjoy. Most of these very famous works of art, like the Head of Nefertiti or the caryatids in the Parthenon complex in Athens, they are perfectly proportioned on 1 is to 1.618. The Taj Mahal is a romance of proportions. Not only 1 is to 1.618, but so many geometric regulation lines, what you call an entire broad, what you call family of ratios called as the golden ratios, which later on were celebrated in the Italian Renaissance times. That is 1 is to 1, 1 is to 2, 1 is to 3, 1 is to 4, 1 is to root 2, 1 is to root 3. These are all perceived to be beautiful by across humanity. We have now begun the what you call the anti-walk, what I will call the anti-walk. You know, having visited a monument, now you are retreating and you are trying to relate to so many facets. Now, this is of course a shot from Akbar's tomb. These were typically the interiors, not the Taj, but the Taj was modeled on this. We are trying to understand Taj through a collective repository of works. There was a huge fight as to how much of Chhatris that would go into the Taj, because a very strong influencing factor was this iconic Panch Mahal in Fatehpur Sikri, built earlier. And of course, we are in the anti-walk. The Taj as contrasted by its turrets, extremely beautiful building. Buland Darwaza, which was a huge influence on the proportions of the Taj's niches, was built a good about 40-50 years prior. The geometrical patterns. I'm sure you're aware that Islam prohibits the use of animal and human forms because they are considered to be closest to the image of God. So as a mark of respect, the Quran advises again. So they have to do entirely with florical and geometrical patterns. This is the influence of the Jain, the Vedic and the Jain Toran, the flying Toran on the Islamic arch. Moving on to the part where the whole disappears, but still the ethic of beauty, the ethic of control, the ethic of balance, the ethic of a very, very, investing in high art is always present in the Taj Mahal. An extremely beautiful composition of jalis on a doorway. And notice how it is asymmetric. This is something, this is a thought which instigated the movement of postmodernism, where complexities and contradictions, where something symmetrical and something set about in a very expected format need not be beautiful. There is these offsets, there is this bringing together of different things, that there is this kick to your mind, and as to you look at something, there is a visual illusion, and then you look carefully, you see different things, look more, you see something still very different. All these techniques were employed in the panels of the Taj. At the same time, it was never overdone. Extremely beautiful in its restraint, as I keep saying. Very beautiful Pietra work, the applique work, followed by the Romans later on traveling through Persia. It was all colored marble and deep insets. The Taj is, it is a monument which is accidentally or intentionally, both intentionally and also some bit accidentally. It is like an living organism, like it shows biomorphism with the changing light, with the changing seasons, with the changing time, with the changing perspectives. It changes itself and still it remains beautiful. The Minar was intentionally not embellished to contrast with the monument and leave a sense of strong purity. Every placement of bench, because the architects know that in such a large monument there are passageways, people will move, You need to pause. These are forceful pauses that are design decisions. So, you're made to sit there and look at vistas and views and frames. This is the anti-walk. We are reminiscing in the Taj. A very strong aspect of the Taj coming from the Hindu monuments, because there was a strong awareness in the crack team of architects of all the famous monuments of India, and principally, the ethic of Hindu religious architecture also very much. This Khajuraho, why I'm showing you this is that most Hindu temples are very much rooted to the ground in its very form and its rendition. It is something that never leaves the ground. It is rooted to the ground. The Taj was designed to be rooted to the ground, as against its precursors in Persia and in Samarkand, or in the Greco-Roman, what you call, philosophy, where the cathedrals are and earlier Greek temples are left to soar the sky, travel the land, a very direct expression of scale and intent and logic approach. The Eastern thought is different. The Taj is also very regal. I'm not saying that it is influenced by the tiger, but it is regal like this, like you see this animal, so self-confident. When you are at the top of the chain in any system, in any development, in any art, you exude the confidence of stability, of regality, of also at the same time being rooted to the ground, mind you. So the Taj is not overly cubist. Like it does not feel the need to display openly like Picasso did in breaking up art into the fundamental geometric shapes. It never feels the need to that, and it also does not feel the need to overdo it like the Baroque period did in Renaissance Christian art. It is something which is much more controlled and balanced. I think I have overshot a little, but it has been a very pleasant journey. For some reason in this particular PPS, I'm missing the last two slides, but it's fine. It's fine. I have concluded. I have said everything that I wanted to say. And I think Parulekar sir, we should now invite participation from members. Was I heard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I'll request everybody to put the questions on chat. Chatterjee, sir, can you see the chat?
1 minute. Yeah.
There are not many questions still, but people will put. There are one or two questions.
There were some questions which came prior to the session through email and other media.
Yeah, you can answer them.
Yeah, I'm very thankful because all of them were very interesting insights. And what happens is that when you make, curiosity is fostered by discussion, and curiosity is also fostered by many-sidedness. So it is not my mind which is singular and which is singularly curious. You too are, and it is our collective exploration which will make us understand everything better. So there was a reference to, I think, Mimar Sinan and his influence, which I've already answered during the talk. There was also a reference to iconography, which also I have answered, because there was a request to touch upon iconography, and we saw how the designers of the Taj had to balance it out between Baroque, that is very high embellishment, and what you call high romance, like the Persians demonstrated. And there was another question which is slipping. There was another question with respect to the 8 heavens that are in Islamic philosophy. Herein, let me stress that again, there is no singularity about this 8 heaven concept, because in all religions of the world, the fundamental axis of the religion has to be established. Like in Islam, it is the Kaaba, or it was Prophet Muhammad was brilliant in that respect. He had chosen the rock of he developed the rock of Abraham, and he molded it into a pure cube which is black. And what is the cube? Like in the Vedic or the Jain or the Buddhist, fundamentally Jaina, Buddhists and Sikhs are nothing but Hindus. are sub-streams or sects. So in Hinduism, it is the Meru Danda, which is the principal axis, which is encapsulated in the Shikhara of a temple or the Viman in the South India. Similarly, in Jain temples in the Shikhara, in Buddhist monuments in the Stup, the Meru Danda is enclosed. Like that in Islam, the Kaaba or the pure cube is enclosing what you call the axis, and the axis is commanding the directions, because it's an orientation of space, because it is like the culture is developing, or the culture is designed around an axis, and the axis has to be established by direction. So there are the four cardinals and the four ordinals, making up 8. Now in all religions, these 8 directions are deified. Okay, so the 8 heavens, of course, because these all of these 2 monuments were also deeply religious and deeply philosophical. So the 8 heaven concept is there, but it is very difficult to have singular names to that, because in all religions these 8 axes are named very differently. Like in Buddhism, the Buddhist axis, they are named differently in India, in Nepal, in Burma, in Japan, in China. Like the Brahmaputra is named differently in, say, in Tibet, where it is Zangpo, and then it changes its name. 3 different names. So the Everest is Sagarmatha, and it's different for the Chinese, is different for us, and different for the Britishers also. Would love to call it Everest. Therefore, the 8 heavens are there, but as time passes and as philosophy embellishes culture, the names keep changing. So I think
there is a first question is at 5:25. Shall I read it, or you can access the chat?
Can I get that?
Yeah, I'll read it out. It is at 5:25. Taj Mahal was a Hindu temple built by Raja Parmavarti Devi in 1155. Tejo Mahalaya was annexed by Shah Jahan in 1632.
Okay,
Please confirm.
I was expecting that this question would come up. In fact, I would only say that I will not take the name, but his name is also very famous. There was not one gentleman, but several gentlemen who have gone to court on this, and they have not only gone to the High Court, but they have gone to the Supreme Court, and that is one. And the court has made its business to find out. They have consulted a lot of historians. So the end verdict is that it is not proven. And I myself, through my own studies, I can assure you that the Taj Mahal was definitely not built on any Hindu temple spoil. Though that bend of the Yamuna River is very interesting. And to its sides, today there are still village deities, but still the Taj, as far as historical records say, the Taj is a greenfield project that was built, and most of the Mughals, though Babur is, questionably credited with a lot of initial violence. I will not get into that because it is very controversial. But after Babur, most of the other princes and then emperors, they were very deeply integrated into the Hindu cultural mainstream. And Akbar was one of the early ones, like Humayun, of course. Humayun was a scholar. Humayun also was deeply mystically philosophical also. And the women also very important, because a lot of intermarriages, lot of their wives are Hindu, whether the mothers are Hindu. Akbar having created Din-e-Ilahi, wherein many religions were brought together, but Din-e-Ilahi was very strongly influenced by Hinduism itself. Jehangir's mother was a Hindu, and there were other Hindu alliances of his sister, of his cousin. So one of the wives of Shah Jahan also was a cousin of, was a younger cousin of, of his. So I do not think that such a thing has happened. And if we want to find out from history, there are several examples where outright Hindu temples were being. The very first, when Qutbuddin entered, he broke Prithviraj Chauhan's principal temple and used the spoils to make a mosque. The same thing was done by him in Ajmer also. The principal temple in Ajmer was broken. If you go to Daulatabad fort, and if you go to the Jami Masjid there, then it is built with the spoils of Hindu and Jain temples. So there are outright examples everywhere. So many monuments have been desecrated, but that is not so with the Taj Mahal. Can we move on to
Yeah.
other questions?
I'll,
See, we must
yeah.
must also try to understand that it's impossible to answer all questions.
Yeah.
Let us make a selection from
Yeah, selection only. I'm just.
yes.
You can go.
One
chat
question
is-
I can see. One
Hmm.
question I can see as to the foundations of the Taj. Of course, like I have very able structural designers attending this conference, so forgive me if I falter in giving this answer, but I am giving this answer out of purely my interest and out of my reading. So the decision making is default in the Taj Mahal because it is a treacherous sand, silted sand of the Yamuna. Okay, so it's very difficult. So they had to go for piling, and they had to go for wooden piling. The wood was extremely seasoned and treated with plant-based anti-termite treatment driven through oil. So in the last rounds of seasoning, what happens is that you drive this anti-termite oil through the logs. So there was timber piling, and as I understand, the foundation was a combination of raft and pile. And it was also designed for a raft in under flotation to behave a raft under flotation because there was ingress of the Yamuna during flood during flood in the Yamuna. So the groundwater was very high.
There is a question at 6:15. Since you spoke of the walk to the Taj, please do touch upon the Charbagh landscape design. There were fruit trees planted, and one was not supposed to see the Taj right away, as is seen now with manicured lawn. This is correct.
Yes. Before I go on to this question, I'll just quickly add to the foundations that
Okay.
in many parts the foundations were timber plus brick also, like it was composite, especially when you are coming above the pile head level. There was a lot of composite work also because it couldn't be entirely wood alone, and it couldn't be stone, otherwise it would have, there was a fear that it would sink, so brick was used a lot. Anyway, now I'll come to the Charbagh pattern. I didn't get the question precisely. That a lot of fruit trees. Can I read the question somewhere, or can you repeat it for me?
Yeah, since you spoke of the walk to the Taj, please do touch upon the Charbagh landscape design. There were fruit trees planted, and one was not supposed to see the Taj right away, as is seen now with manicured lawns. Is it correct?
Well, I have got a painting to that effect, uh, but now it's very difficult to answer this question. Give me a moment if you have the patience.
Yeah.
Let me try to what do you call, just get to this. Uh, some yes. Now I'm better placed. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I don't have it here, but I have a painting exactly describing what the gentleman was, asking, and well, I may not be in a position to, or rather, I'm not fit to answer this question in its entirety. My only contention out here is that had the Taj's view been blocked by what you call the fruit trees, then it would go against the principles of the symmetric purity that is built in the concept of the uh, Charbagh garden, because again the Muslim philosophies and iconographies are very strongly influenced by the Greco-Roman, the very formal logic of Christianity, or the Greco-Roman times, pre-Christian times also, where symmetry and the keeping the purity of symmetry and also the clarity of decision making, that once you have making people fall through the gate, and once you want to throw open the Taj to viewership, then you do not want to build further screens. So it would have gone against the concept, but I do not know what actually so many years back would be the decision. It's not possible to find out. The next question.
Next question. it was a news saying that there is a color change in the monument. My question is, how is it maintained, and the cracks in stone, how is that taken care, as its aesthetic view is extremely important. That is related to conservation.
Okay, to this I would like to say that about 1.5 years back, I had the good fortune of going to the Taj again with family and friends. At that time, the government of India, I saw, had embarked on a very organized cleaning program or a conservation program, wherein the dome was completely, what do you call, cleaned up. In fact, even the scaffoldings were removed, and the dome was unbelievably beautiful, mind you, with the marble restored to its near original purity. The dome was magical, almost like it was giving goosebumps. मतलब रोंगटे खड़े हो गए थे हाथ के. It was so beautiful, and they were progressively going to chemically clean the other parts of the Taj Mahal. That was going on earlier. The minars were, I think, conserved, repaired, and conserved, though not completely cleaned. So this is the good action happening in Taj Mahal, but somehow the insensitive action that is happening, which I also noticed, was that much of the Taj is barricaded. You are no longer allowed to enter the main chamber. You're not allowed to enter only, fundamentally. So the entire experience of Taj is what you call from outside. It is not from the inside. Because from the inside, even if they allow you to enter, they have put barricades and they will just allow you to move through a very small dark corridor and get out immediately. Also, there is barricading to the niches. The niches where there aren't doors, there are only windows and jalis. They have placed some very ugly wooden and what you call wooden barricades, freestanding barricades. And what happens is when you go to appreciate the Taj aesthetic qualities, those barricades, they disturb your, they come into the frame and they disturb you. So very sad.
Uh, can we move? Yeah. There is one question from the senior architect Ullas Rane sir. Mughal garden of Taj is equally important since it subtly adds to the beauty of Taj without overpowering it. You missed this important aspect. Can you elaborate a little bit on Mughal garden?
Yes, I agree. There are actually thousands of other aspects of the Taj Mahal, and I would invite all of you to, when possible, that we should actually physically go there and experience it. It was not possible to cover all aspects in this lecture, and I also missed a couple of end slides, as I said, because of this conversion to a PowerPoint show. But doesn't matter. We have already consumed a lot of time, and I think the main ethic of my talk is done. But you're right, sir, that the garden was a beautiful complement to the Taj Mahal, and it always is. It's not in the case of Taj Mahal. A very well done landscape always contributes to a building, and vice versa. Like it is a communication between a building to the garden and the garden to the building, like it is with a human being to the monument, and the human being to and the monument to the human being. Similarly, it is to the landscape garden to the human being and the human being to the landscape. So there are several multi-level communications that are going on. So the Mughal garden is indeed a very beautiful, what you call, complement to the Taj's setting, and it actually, जैसे हिंदी में कहते हैं, हम चार चांद लगा दिया और इस ताज को भी चार चांद लगा दिया. So it is something like that. So I fully agree with you.
Yeah. Next question is, I have heard that 4 minar built around Taj Mahal are intentionally slant. What is the reason behind it?
That is true. That is a simple, what you call, theory of what you call illusion or correction in what you call in the visual illusion, which the Greeks very much used. When the Greeks had their letterings or labels on their temples, then intentionally they would make the upper letters bigger, progressively, or they would optically correct. It's called optical correction. So they would optically correct the letters. So the actual dimensions of the letters would be varying. But when in the human perspective, from the experiential level, when you would look, then you would see it in its pure, what you call, perspective. Now, this optical correction is very much used in very many places. It has been used in the minars of the Taj Mahal also. And a very common example is in the cricket broadcast, cricket match broadcast nowadays, that the logo where the bowler is starting his run up, that logo is optically corrected. So in the television camera, you see it in its correct proportion. But for the bowler actually on the field or for the spectators, it is distorted completely. So this is optical correction. The Taj's Minars had to be optically corrected. Otherwise, they would be, when you approach such a huge monument, when you would be very near to it, then it would be looking splayed or inclined. So they are optically corrected by what you call a departure from the pure axis, so that in the human perspective, they are seen as completely erect or completely perpendicular to the plinth. So in that respect, you are right.
Next question is, do we have details of how the building was built?
Oh, now this is a very broad subject. So,
So very, very difficult to.
so
But any
much
details,
of it I have
broadly
covered.
details are available or not? That's what you want.
See, it was built in marble and limestone in masonry. If I were to give you the categories of civil engineering, it was a masonry monument. It was a load-bearing structure, and we have already talked about the foundations. And a lot of attention was paid to the quality of the lime mortar. In those days, the lime mortar was almost like a lime concrete mortar with a lot of investiture of this broken china mosaic and straw and vegetable gum was used a lot, and many other binding materials and reinforcing aggregates were used in the mortar itself. And the lime itself was very well cultured. Today we do not have the culture only of making good lime. So a mortar was used a lot in the masonry. It was not dry masonry. It was all mortared masonry. And of course, interlocking of blocks is what you call, and it was very well known to Indian masons right from Ashokan times, or times of 350 BC. So it is said that anyway, I will not now go into further details. I was going to go into Porus and Alexander and how they were turning points in the marriage between Greco-Roman and Indian architecture, but then we'll not do that now. We can take the next question.
Next question. Senior structural designer Milind Kulkarni has informed that the well foundations were used for a Taj Mahal. It's just a statement, not a question.
मैंने पहले ही माफी ले ली थी
Yeah.
But a lot of piling was timber piling was definitely used.
There is a question from Mr. Satish Patankar. Any information about sequence and method of construction?
Which I think we have covered, because it was like any building, like first the foundation, then the backfilling, then the plinth, then the masonry structure, because load bearing. So you go from bottom up. Okay. In RCC frame, you have the freedom of going top down also, but here it's different. So I think the sequence was something that was default, and it is said that the Taj was, the historical records say that it was commissioned in 1632, a year after Mumtaz Mahal passed away, and it took about 20 years, less than 20 years to complete. Actually, it was ready by 1647, but it was finally commissioned in 1652. And this date is also very interesting. I forgot to tell that. I'll just take a few seconds to say the Taj is the culmination of the Islamic rule in India, because Aurangzeb, who came afterwards, he was a very jittery type of character, very suspicious and very unstable politically. And his attitudes led to the demise of the Mughal Raj, and East India Company had entered by then, and the Britishers and the other colonial entrants like the Dutch and the French were taking pole position. They had better armory, more modern warfare, tools of warfare, and the Islamic kings were subjugated. Only small local kingdoms like Sirajuddin in Bengal and the Nizam in Hyderabad, they were left, and then they became vassals of the British. And then it moved into a British takeover, and then of course the freedom for independence and the influence of industrial revolution and the modern times that came on us. So the Taj is a turning point. Taj is built at a turning point, unintentionally of course, but still it is a culmination of the Islamic ideal through architecture in India. Next question, please.
The same question is annexed further is what is the time duration for construction? All the other things we have.
Yeah, so that was answered, that actually they took about 16-17 years to build. And for such a big mounting, wherein this period also accommodated all their study tours, and so many years went in study tours itself, is it not? Therefore ye log tukdi bhejte the, they didn't have the freedom for all of them to go. So two people would go to, say, Istanbul, or two people would go to Parthenon. The team principals, having visited the main monuments, would got to the business of designing the monument.
Next question. Could you kindly elaborate a bit on the Black Taj?
The Black Taj was an intention. Like, this comes from, again, the very formal Greco-Roman philosophy, which is getting into Islam through, that the regions of Jerusalem or Asia Minor, where, the Hebrews and the Christians and the Muslims, they are all sharing same prophets, and the same formalism in thought. So, like, the Western thought has got God and Saturn. So God has to have a Saturn. Like, the yin has to have yang. The Chinese yin and yang is slightly different, mind you, but the Western thought is of continuously having the counterpoint, whereas the Vedic philosophy later on, of course, in also the subsects of Buddhism and others, in Sikhism also, like Guru Nanak Dev Ji says, Ek Onkar, like, or Shankara says, the only one. In our philosophy, Shiv is supposed to be the final principle, and he is the only singular principle. There is no Saturn or there is no anti-principle to Shiv. His wife is a good counterpoint to him, because that is again a different subject. There is this very famous painting in Elephanta where Shiv and Parvati are playing the game of dice, and every time Shiv loses to Parvati, and he has to lose, because if he does not lose, then creation will not happen. The Big Bang will not happen, and the universe will not expand, and be like that. So Parvati is desire. Parvati is the symbolism of Prakriti, for creation to happen. So in that respect, she is a counterpoint. At the same time, she is also very complementing, being the wife to Shiva. So we do not have a Saturn concept. We do not have a diametrically opposite concept. But Islam does have. So the white of the Taj was supposed to be, bound by another black replica across the bank of the Yamuna. If you give me a moment, can all of us see the screen?
Yeah.
Then what happens is that I can, I'm sorry, it's all mashed up. Yes, here it is. Now, across the Yamuna, look, there is what you call another charbagh that you see to the north. Can all of us see it?
Yeah.
Just across, perfectly axial to the Taj Mahal and the garden, there is another garden across the Yamuna. And you can see what you call, a cleared up area which was supposed to house the black replica. Now, I'm not saying that what Google Earth is capturing is something that has survived these almost how many years? Almost say about 500, 450, 500 years. I'm not saying that, but through culture, through tradition, through myth, that particular garden is still protected, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So you can see that. But beyond this, not much is known about what you call the Taj.
We'll take a few questions now. You were told that the Taj is a bit off-center to respect the river. Can you talk about a little more?
No, it is not off-centered. It is clinging to the river, but it didn't build a wall. Like, the Taj complex had a screening wall all around from all sides. But as a respect to the Yamuna, there isn't a wall on the Yamuna face. So it is like the monument is open to interact with the river. That's what I said.
Yeah. Is there any information about how the big stones were piled up or placed at top of the tomb? I don't think there are big stones.
I think it was very handleable. The real challenge was in the big temple of Thanjavur to
Correct.
place the cupola above the pyramid.
Mm.
And there is this very famous story of how they built progressive small hillocks and progressive tiered scaffoldings and brought down the heavy cupola through many meters of travel. Actually, more than rather kilometers of travel through a ramp, which was propped up by these tiered scaffoldings, and then they directly brought and placed it on top of the Vimana of the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur. A very beautiful example, a grand example. You must visit if you have not seen. So that was the real challenge. Transporting the very heavy limestone blocks of the Great Pyramid of Gizeh was again a huge challenge for which many films have been shown on National Geographic. Taj was not a challenge because these stones were not that heavy, and at that time you had metal or iron based. Now why I don't say steel is that whether the composition then of the iron chain would actually be the same as that of steel composition is very difficult to say. But there were iron chains and there were pulley mechanisms, simple tripod pulley mechanisms to hoist heavy blocks. That was all there when the Taj was being built, so it wasn't a challenge.
This seems to be a last question. Did Taj construction affect the further generation of Indo-Islamic work?
I'm sorry, sir, you broke away.
Did Taj construction affect the further generation of Indo-Islamic work?
It did not at all stop. In fact, very beautiful examples happened even after the Taj. Now you're making me think, because see, what happened was that the regional powers, they continued to build. No, the Nizam's territory was an excellent example. It was not only the Qutub Shahi tombs, but there were some very beautiful. I don't know whether you have gone to Hyderabad and you have seen the tombs, the stucco tombs of the ministers of the Nizam. Um, uh, they are extremely beautiful. And since the Britishers had entered, there was a lot of this marriage between British architectural traditions and Indo-Islamic architectural traditions, which you see a lot in Bombay also, at the fag end of it. But much of it happened in Bengal because the British were earlier what you call very much planted there, and there was a lot of influence of the good architectural contribution of Sirajuddin in Bengal. And there was a lot of intermarriage between the clay temples of Vishnupur and something like the Atala Masjid, and that influenced so many things.
Please continue.
Yeah, I think I'm done. That
Fine. That was the last question from the chat, and now it's almost.
I just actually it was slipping my memory, but they are called Paiga tombs. The Paiga tombs of Hyderabad. Please do go and visit. Marvelous monuments and an excellent example of how there can be a deviant contribution post the decline of Islam in India, a political decline, I believe. Okay.
It's almost 6:45. Almost we are there for 1 hour 45 minutes. And thank you for the excellent lecture.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll request Mr. Jayant Kulkarni to close the today's session. Mr. Jayant Kulkarni, yeah, can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah. Your video is not working.
Hello.
आवाज है पर your video is not seen. Please start video.
Hello.
There is some disturbance. Yeah.
I must thank Indranil. We had been listening to Indranil at various locations, various historical monuments. That is our lucky to visit along with his report. And Indranil, if you can announce our next session.
I think there is a
there is a proposal. There is a proposal to, like, this was a repertoire lecture. There was a proposal come from the organizers that sometime down the near future we also have a session on understanding the Hindu temple, which is another hero of ours which we have not understood at all, most of us. I'm sorry, but it's not that I have understood, and it is not an egotistic statement, but it is an attitude towards our heroic cultural heritage that many of us carry, not all of us. And if through architectural curiosity we can help improve this attitude a little, that is the whole intention.
Fine.
Thank you. I think
Yeah,
many
we are through,
participants
and
are leaving, so I
because
thank
there is some disturbance in Mr. Jayan Kulkarni's talk.
Nachiket.
Yeah, I think we'll.
Thank everybody and continue.
Yeah. I'll just thank everybody, and especially Mr. Indrajit Chatterjee for this wonderful talk. And we can meet in our next webinar. I do request everybody to please attend our webinar series regularly. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.